I always figured security cameras were about productivity, that they existed to keep people from lingering in the hallways too long, to make sure deadlines were hit, that actual work was getting done and not just looking like it. That was the official version, at least. The version everyone repeats in meetings with that serious tone of someone being responsible and modern at the same time. But I learned, in the most unexpected way possible, that security cameras can record things that have absolutely nothing to do with productivity. And that sometimes what they capture is exactly what a person has spent years trying to hide. Not from others, but from themselves. My name's Lucas Andrade. I'm 26, a graphic designer, and I've been at a logistics company in Uberlandia inland, Minas Gerais for the past 7 months. I know how that sounds. A small town and graphic design don't exactly go together, or so it seems. But the company needed someone to modernize their visual communication. Outdated internal materials, a visual identity that hadn't been touched in 12 years, corporate presentations straight out of 2008, and I needed a job that paid well enough to make leaving São Paulo worth it. That's how I ended up there, the newest employee of a company that's been around for 22 years and boasts about it on absolutely every wall, every commemorative plaque, every year-end speech. If that company had one thing, it was tradition. Heavy tradition. It meant clear hierarchy, respect for rank, and workplace relationships played by unwritten rules everyone somehow knew. What people thought of you mattered not as some abstract social thing, but in real practical ways. It wasn't hostile, don't get me wrong. People are polite, the processes work, the breakfast the company provides in the break room every day is genuinely good and builds more loyalty than any benefits policy ever could. But there's this constant buzz of caution you pick up on right away. You're always being watched, not meanly, but constantly. Not literally by cameras, not yet, but by invisible rules no one ever spelled out but everyone somehow knows. I adapted fast. It's a talent or a curse, depends how you look at it. I learned the routine. Show up on time. Say less than I knew in meetings, but enough to seem sharp. Keep certain things about myself hidden. I learned to use my headphones at my desk as a visible signal to the world that I was focused and shouldn't be interrupted by trivialities. The headphones were armor. They created this bubble that said one thing without me opening my mouth. I'm focused, leave me alone, don't interrupt. Small control, but it worked. I never realized back then the profound irony in all of it. The company has 130 employees, give or take. Most of them work on the ground floor in the operations warehouse, where trucks come and go on coordinated schedules and the pace is set by a logistics system that doesn't forgive imprecision. The offices are on the second floor, in an open plan space they internally call the administrative floor, a name that sounds much more solemn than it actually is in practice, which is just a sequence of desks with mid-height partitions, a few potted plants that miraculously survive the lack of natural light, and a meeting room with smoked glass walls that creates the illusion of privacy without actually providing it. At the back of the floor, separated from the open space by an entire wall of clear glass, is the operations manager's office. It's visible from almost anywhere on the administrative floor. From my spot specifically, I could see the office with perfect clarity, the large desk with 2 monitors, the document shelf in the back, the black leather chair. You can completely see who's in there, follow their body language, notice if there are other people in the room or if the person is alone. But you can't hear a thing. The glass is soundproof. It's like watching a movie on mute, and sometimes you find yourself imagining what's being said, filling in the blanks with interpretation. The operations manager's name is Renato Meireles. He's 38, has been with the company for 12 years, and has a presence you notice before you even see his badge or hear his name. It's not a matter of physique or the volume of his voice or any of those obvious markers of authority. It's a quality of attention that he carries with him. The concrete feeling that when Renato Meireles is in a room, he's monitoring everything happening in it. The rhythm of conversations, the micro-expressions on people's faces, the slight deviations in productivity that others would pass by without noticing. He leads meetings like an engineer supervising a critical process, with absolute precision, no wasted time, no unnecessary deviations from the established script. People respect that in a way that's almost a reflex. Some fear it, others admire it with genuine intensity. Most, I suspect, do both at the same time and don't look too closely at the combination. I stayed neutral, or tried to. Renato was my indirect supervisor, which meant he approved communication projects that interfaced with operations, but he didn't manage my day-to-day schedule or give me feedback on shorter deadlines. In the first few weeks of work, we had maybe 3 interactions in total, All brief, all professional to the highest degree. I would present the material, he would examine it with very brief but seemingly complete attention, approve it with 1 or 2 words of feedback that were precise and useful. And that was it. I would leave the glass office feeling like I had been evaluated, approved, and filed away in the correct category. It was efficient. It was the kind of working relationship that doesn't create complications. It was in this environment that the announcement about the cameras arrived. On a Tuesday in March, early in the afternoon, we received an internal memo. Brief, formal, formatted with the company logo in the header and the board of directors' signature at the bottom. It informed us that, in alignment with corporate security best practices and the compliance requirements of the new large-scale contracts the company was closing, an integrated camera monitoring system would be installed in the coming days on the administrative floor and in the main operational areas. An informational meeting would take place on Thursday at 2:00 p.m., led by the operations manager, Camilla Costa, who worked 2 desks away from me and had a professional habit of reading corporate memos with the expression of someone deciphering a coded message. Read the text, let out her characteristic sigh that says everything without using words, and looked at me. Camilla is 28. She's a marketing analyst, graduated from USP, and came to Uberlandia following a boyfriend who ended the relationship 6 months after the move for reasons she describes as classic without elaborating. She stayed because, according to her, she genuinely liked the city and wasn't going to let a breakup dictate her geography. She said that phrase once and never needed to repeat it because her attitude was already clear enough on a daily basis. She is my best friend in the office, a statement I've never explicitly told her, but which she probably knows, because Camilla knows things before they are said. Cameras, she said, with that specific intonation of someone interpreting fate with no hope of stopping it. It makes sense from a risk management standpoint, I said. New large contracts usually bring stricter compliance requirements. She looked at me for a moment with that expression. The expression I'd learned to recognize over 7 months of daily coexistence as the Lucas, I know you know this isn't just about what you just said expression. I put my headphones back in my ears, but I kept thinking about the memo for longer than I probably should have. On Thursday at exactly 2:00 p.m., the meeting room was full. Practically the entire administrative floor had shown up, not out of a genuine interest in the camera system, but out of the unspoken logic that meetings called by Renato Meireles were meetings you attended without questioning the invite. Renato gave the presentation standing, 1 simple slide behind him. Big font, tight text, no frills. It was pure Renato. No waste, nothing that didn't have a purpose. He explained the system with the practical clarity of someone who deeply understands what he is explaining. Coverage cameras at the building's entrances and exits, cameras in the hallways of both floors. Coverage of the highest traffic areas on the administrative floor. The recordings would be stored locally for 30 days, with access restricted to a small group of managers and the IT team for maintenance. He cited the contracts, cited the logistics sector's compliance requirements for operations over a certain size, cited 2 or 3 examples of similar companies that already operated with equivalent systems. No one asked questions. It was the kind of silence that happens when a statement leaves no room for doubt without having to explicitly say so. I was sitting in the 3rd row, slightly to the right of center, with a notepad in front of me because I always carry a notepad into meetings. I wasn't writing anything down. I was observing Renato. He moved across the room with that spare, efficient style he had for everything. Glancing at the slide only as long as needed, nothing wasted. When he scanned the room, it was systematic left to right. No lingering on any one person. You couldn't tell if he was really seeing each person or just checking that the room was still full. Except that at a moment between the explanation of the access protocols and the final slide with the installation schedule, Renato's eyes met mine. It lasted less than a second. It was probably part of the methodical sweep of the audience. There was nothing to justify giving it a different meaning than any other point in the sweep. Even so, I was the first to look away. The meeting ended with the characteristic punctuality of everything Renato ran. People went back to their desks. I left with a blank notepad thinking about the schedule I needed to finish before the end of the workday. I didn't think about the cameras anymore, at least not that day. The installation happened the following week over the course of 2 days. An outsourced technical team went through the administrative floor with step ladders and equipment boxes. The cameras were discreet, small black boxes with a slightly convex lens eye mounted in the upper corners of the hallways and in strategic spots above the work areas. The installation was surgical. They finished the first day with the entire floor covered, and returned on the second to calibrate the angles and test the connectivity with the central server. Most people looked at the cameras once with the momentary curiosity that new and slightly intrusive objects generate, and went back to work. It was the pragmatism of someone who understands that the camera is already there, and symbolic resistance won't change that reality. I did the same, but when I looked a second time, paying more attention than the first, I noticed that one of the cameras had an angle that, from where I stood to evaluate it, pointed suspiciously straight at my workstation. It wasn't impossible. My desk was in the floor's main hallway, which was a high-traffic area. A camera covering that hallway would naturally include my workspace in its field of view. It made complete sense. Even so, I noticed it. The designer in me, that instinct to read framing and angles, filed the detail away with the precision of someone who catalogs visual composition. What happened in the following weeks wasn't a revelation. It was an accumulation. Little things that, on their own, meant absolutely nothing. But that added up with the patience and inevitability with which you build hypotheses you don't want to confirm. The first thing I noticed was that Renato started showing up at my workstation more frequently than before the cameras. Not every day, not in a way that could be described as obvious, but with a new regularity, which contrasted with the rarity of our previous interactions. He would come by with a file that needed a layout adjustment, with a question about the visual identity system I was developing for a partner shipping company, with feedback on an internal communication project. Each visit individually justifiable, none of them in any way outside the expected professional scope. The second thing was that when he did come, he stayed longer than the issue required. Not a lot, never enough to be weird on its own, to generate a comment or an observation from someone else, but a minute longer than necessary. An additional question about the project that he could easily have sent by email. A comment about a color or typography decision that was technically relevant but didn't require physical presence. It was the kind of detail you only notice when you start paying attention. The third thing was the one-on-one meetings. Renato started calling me in for project reviews with a frequency that didn't align with the normal workflow. Once a week, then twice. I would go into the glass office, sit in the chair facing his desk, and we would talk about visual communication, about alignment with the company's identity, about approvals and adjustments, all professional, all within what could be described as managerial diligence for a high-visibility communication project. And even so, it was on a Tuesday afternoon that Camilla named the pattern out loud. She was cutting a kiwi with the knife she keeps in the second drawer on the left because the break room never has a decent knife. A habit I found weird the first week and now find completely normal. She cut the kiwi without looking at me and said, with the casualness of someone making a remark about the weather, "Have you noticed that Renato shows up at your desk a lot?" "He's the operations manager," I said. "The projects I'm developing interface directly with operations. It makes sense for him to keep a close eye on them." She popped a piece of kiwi in her mouth, chewed and considered. "Does he keep a close eye on the other designers too?" There were 2 other designers at the company. They worked mostly with graphic materials for the commercial sector. "I don't know," I said, which was true. But the fact that I didn't know and had never thought to check was in itself information. She gave me that look. I put my headphones on. The question lingered. And that week, for a reason that had no direct relation to any of these observations, it had to do with a system update the IT team was running that required me to generate access log reports for shared files. I was given temporary access to the camera system's admin panel. It was basic access, view only, to confirm the logs were being generated correctly, but the panel showed the live feeds. One afternoon, while waiting for a data export process to finish, I opened the panel and looked at the camera angles for the first time with real attention. The camera positioned over the main hallway covered, as I had noticed during installation, my workstation. With considerable clarity, you could see my monitor screen, the position of my chair, my workspace in reasonable detail. The camera in Renato's office was in the upper corner, angled to cover his desk and the entrance, but the angle was tilted slightly to the left, which meant that, in addition to the inside of the office, it captured a strip of the outside administrative floor visible through the transparent glass wall. The strip that included my desk. I closed the panel. I sat for a moment looking at the work on my main screen, which suddenly seemed very far away. It was coincidence. Installation crews follow standard angles. They don't orchestrate shots. No reason to read this as intentional. Just corporate pareidolia seeing patterns where there's only data. I kept repeating this to myself. But the pattern kept forming, with the persistence that patterns have when you've trained yourself to see them. What I had, if I was being honest with myself, and that afternoon I started to be, was a list. Not one I'd made consciously, but one that had built itself from weeks of noticing things I didn't want to notice. Renato showed up at my desk more often than the job required. One-on-one meetings were more frequent than necessary. The camera angle in his office had a direct line of sight to my workstation. In the hallway that Thursday, the eye contact had lasted a second longer than expected. Any single item was not only explainable but irrelevant. The whole list was different. But I also had the other list. The list of rational explanations that I built and rebuilt with the diligence of someone protecting themselves from a conclusion they don't know how to handle. 1. Renato was meticulous and consistently diligent with all high visibility projects, and the communication projects I was developing were genuinely high visibility for that company at that time. 2. He was new to the experience of working with an in-house graphic designer, having outsourced that role for years, and the natural learning curve of that working relationship explained the frequency of contact. 3. The fact that Camilla had noticed only meant that Camilla noticed everything, a known and documented trait of hers, and didn't constitute evidence of anything beyond that. 4. The camera angle was determined by standard technical coverage, installed by external professionals without any specific instructions about who worked where. The list was solid. It held up to scrutiny. Each item was individually defensible. And yet there was one thing underneath the list that didn't fit into any of the 4 explanations. There was what I knew about Renato. Not the flawless operations manager who appeared in meetings, but the person who existed beneath that role, whom I only knew in fragments collected unintentionally over months. 12 years at the same company, not because there were no opportunities elsewhere, but because that structure was apparently the anchor of his identity. No visible social life outside of mandatory corporate functions. And then, a piece of information that Camilla had mentioned in passing during some breakroom conversation. With the naturalness with which she mentioned everything. Renato was separated, about 8 months, from a 10-year marriage. She hadn't elaborated. I hadn't asked. The information had been stored in a place in my memory that I didn't even know I had activated. Separation from a 10-year marriage, 8 months out, an entire life structure, marital, social, identity undone in a relatively short time frame, while a man who had built his whole persona on control and precision tried to keep showing up to work as if nothing had fundamentally changed. I shouldn't be thinking about this. It had nothing to do with cameras, projects, meeting frequency, or fields of view. And then the hallway thing happened. One Thursday, after a material approval review that had ended earlier than expected, I was leaving the meeting room, walking toward my desk with my notepad under my arm, my head already on the next item of the day. Renato was coming from the opposite direction, toward the glass office at the back. The section of the hallway between the meeting room and the main floor is narrower than the rest, a passage where 2 people need to slightly adjust their pace relative to each other. We did that, we adjusted, and at the exact moment we crossed paths. Not before, not after, in that half second of physical proximity that isn't chosen but is inevitable. Renato looked at me. It wasn't the look of someone passing someone else in a professional hallway. It was a look that lasted a second longer than hallway looks usually do. I don't know how to describe it more precisely because precision isn't something that exists in this specific memory. What prevails is the density of the moment, a fraction of time where there was no professional deflection, where the look was simply the look without the managerial filter that normally framed it. "Good afternoon," I said. "Good afternoon," he said. We each went our own way. That night I spent 2 hours in front of a visual identity project without producing anything usable. I kept going back to the hallway with the obsession of someone trying to determine if what they remember is what happened or what they constructed later. I kept going over the characteristics of the moment, trying to identify where I was projecting and where I was reading into things. I kept asking myself if I was seeing something that wasn't there or refusing to see something that was. The hypothesis I refused to name directly became a little less refused that night. It was a Thursday, 2 days before an urgent deadline, a set of internal communication pieces that the commercial director wanted ready for an early Monday presentation. That's why I had stayed late. The administrative floor empties out quickly after 6:30 p.m. Most people taking advantage of the lighter traffic in Uberlandia to get home at a reasonable time for dinner. By 7:30 p.m., I was one of the few still on the floor, possibly the only one in my department. The automatic lighting had already dimmed in the sectors with no detected movement, fully activating only in zones where a presence was confirmed. This created strange lighting in the space, islands of full fluorescent light in the partial darkness, which I usually found slightly unsettling. But that night I was simply ignoring it because there was work to be done. I had 2 monitors at my workstation. On the main one, the open project. On the secondary one, the camera systems administration panel, which I still had access to because the final log report hadn't been delivered yet. I rarely looked at the second monitor consciously. I used the panel when I needed to pull specific data, and right then I didn't need anything from it. The feed stayed active in the background, an open window I wasn't using. At 7:47 p.m., something in my peripheral vision caught a detail on the second monitor. I don't know exactly what it was. It could have been a change in the image's brightness. It could have been movement. The kind of thing peripheral vision detects before the conscious brain processes what it's seeing. Whatever it was, I looked. Renato's office was lit. He was still there, alone with the door closed, the only light on at that end of the floor, visible on the camera feed with the clarity of images in well-lit environments. I noticed it and went back to the project. It was absolutely normal for an operations manager to stay late. There was nothing unusual about that. But 2 or 3 minutes later, I looked again. Renato was in front of his computer, and something about the tilt of his posture was different from his working mode. He was leaning back in his chair, not leaning forward with the concentration of someone reviewing spreadsheets or answering emails, but in a more open, more contemplative position. On the screen, the interface he had opened wasn't a spreadsheet or a report or any of the operational documents I had seen during project reviews. It was a portfolio. I recognized the visual layout of the images before I could identify the content with certainty. It was the portfolio folder I had uploaded to the company's shared server when I was hired. Samples of past projects, campaign pieces, visual identity work for clients from when I worked at an agency in São Paulo. It was standard to present this upon admission, a way to document one's professional background. Renato was looking at my portfolio at 7:47 p.m. on a Thursday, with the floor emptied out alone, without any operational reason to justify it. I froze completely. My mouse cursor stopped right where it was. He slowly scrolled through the folder, stopping on some projects longer than others, advancing at the speed of someone looking out of pleasure or interest and not out of professional necessity. And then he stopped at a specific section. I knew what it was without needing to see it up close. It was a visual identity project for a youth fashion brand developed 3 years earlier in São Paulo. The project included photographic records of the creative process and a team photo, informal, taken at the end of a presentation, the kind of photo that happens when the tension of a successful project dissolves into collective relief. I was in that photo, smiling, slightly disheveled because I had given a 2-hour presentation, clearly happy. Renato lingered on that image. He stayed still, staring at that screen. For an amount of time I wouldn't be able to clock exactly because time flows at a different frequency in those moments. He wasn't evaluating the project. He was just looking. And then, very slowly, he leaned even further back in his chair, turned his face slightly to the side like someone alone with a difficult thought, and brought both hands to his face, his palms covering his eyes completely. The posture of someone who is exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with working hours. That specific tiredness that comes from within, from carrying something that weighs more than work ever could. It was the gesture of a man who believed no one was watching, who had finally let go of the control he maintained all day long, the operations manager, the systems and processes architect, the man who led meetings with unadorned slides and unblinking stares. What remained in that moment in an empty glass office at 7:47 p.m. was just a person. Renato stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then he slowly lowered his hands, looked at the screen for a moment, at the photo, at me in the photo, closed the portfolio window, and kept staring at the blank screen that was left behind. I closed the camera panel tab. I sat in front of the open project on my main monitor. I couldn't see anything on the screen. My breathing was happening, but I wasn't conscious of it. The sector's automatic lighting hummed in the silence of the empty floor. After an amount of time I couldn't quantify, I saved the project file. I turned off the second monitor, grabbed my backpack. I left the workstation careful not to make a sound, with the kind of instinctive quietness of someone who doesn't want to be heard without knowing exactly why. I took the service stairs on the opposite side of Renato's office. In the parking lot, sitting in my car with the key in the ignition and the engine off. I stayed there longer than made sense. The parking lot security lights cast an orange glow through the windshield, making everything feel slightly surreal. There was a version of the story that was about what Renato was feeling. A story about a man who had built his life upon structures that left no room for certain things, and who now, 8 months after one of those massive structures had collapsed, was coming face to face with what lay beneath. It was a story of loneliness. A story about wearing a mask and what's left when the mask gets tired. And there was a version that was about what it all meant to me. Why I was sitting in that parking lot with the engine off instead of just leaving. Why what I'd seen affected me the way it did, with such specific intensity. And sitting in that car, I realized slowly and with no illusion that I could unlearn it, that both versions of the story were the same story. That the reason what I'd seen was getting to me the way it wasn't just empathy for what I'd witnessed a man go through in a private moment. It was recognition. The shape of the weight I had seen Renato carrying. I knew that shape. Not the exact details, not the specific circumstances, but the shape. The burden of having something existing in parallel to the version you show the world. The fatigue of maintaining the distance between the two. I started the car. I went home. In the following days, I went to work exactly as I always had. I arrived on time, sat at my desk, grabbed my headphones. I worked on my projects for the day, answered emails with the professional objectivity the company expected. I drank the break room coffee in the morning because the coffee was genuinely good, and it was the simplest, most normal thing I could do. But everything was slightly different. The way things get when you know something you shouldn't and realize there's no way to unknow it. I found myself thinking about Renato with a frequency I hadn't asked for and didn't know how to shut off. Not in a way that paralyzed me or kept me from working. It was more like a thought that came back every time I tried to push it away. Like a file you close that the system reopens on its own. I kept reconstructing what I knew about him. Now using what I'd seen as a context that completely changed how I read everything. 12 years at a company that functioned as the backbone of his social and professional identity. A 10-year marriage that had ended. An entire persona. The manager, the process controller, the man who knows how things work and ensures they keep working. Built on the premise that it's possible to keep everything within defined parameters. And then, one night in a glass office, alone, with his face in his hands, staring at a photo of someone. There was a concept I had read about years ago in a completely different context, during research for a visual identity project that used analytical psychology references. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the aspects of ourselves we fail to integrate into our conscious identity because they don't fit into the version we present to the world, the version the world has gotten used to. The shadow doesn't just disappear with repression. It exists in parallel, building up pressure, waiting for the cracks where the containment finally gives way. Renato had found a crack on a Thursday at 7:47 p.m. in an office he thought was empty. I understood that, and understanding it complicated things for me in ways I was still processing. Camilla noticed something had changed before I even said anything, because Camilla always notices things first. It's a talent of hers that is sometimes inconvenient. Something happened, she said, not as a question. It was a Tuesday, the second week after what I had seen in the company break room over morning coffee. I said no. She studied me for a moment, like someone deciding whether to push it or not. Something happened, she repeated, with a calm conviction that didn't need any extra evidence. I said it was complicated. She considered this. Everything that matters is, she said simply, and went back to her yogurt, without pushing any further. She didn't ask again. She didn't put conditions on the space she had left open. That was how Camilla operated with the things that mattered. She would name them and then wait, without any urgency, because she knew some things need space before they can be spoken. I didn't fill the space, but I knew I could whenever I was ready. And that certainty that there was an open space available was in and of itself an important anchor. What occupied my mind the most during those weeks wasn't the question of what to do with what I'd seen. That question, strangely enough, had a clearer answer than I expected. The answer was, keep it. Respect it. Don't turn someone else's private moment into something it wasn't meant to be. Renato hadn't handed that moment over to me. I had seen it without his knowledge, and that created a responsibility I took seriously, with the exact same care he applied to everything. The question that occupied me was a different one. It was the question of Renato as a person, completely separate from the issue of what I had seen. What it cost him day after day to show up at that office with all that precision and control and impeccable technical competence while there was something completely different existing underneath. The burden of carrying that architecture of identity when one of the main walls had collapsed and the rest had to hold itself up without it. I observed Renato at work now with a completely different perspective than the one I had brought to that job 7 months earlier. I saw the manager, and I also saw what lay beneath the manager. The same precise meetings, the same direct feedback, the same quality of attention he carried into every room. All of that continued to exist exactly as before. But now I saw both things at the same time, and seeing both was a radically different experience from seeing just one. There is a project approval meeting that takes place on Wednesdays late in the afternoon, which includes Renato, the commercial director, and 1 or 2 designers or analysts depending on the project at hand. I was called into 2 of those meetings during those weeks. In the first one, I presented the revision of a series of materials for the distribution fleet: side panels, uniform identity, warehouse signage. Renato examined each item with the same calibrated attention as always. He asked technical questions about readability from a distance, the durability of the printing materials, and the production timeline. He approved them with minor adjustments, and throughout the entire meeting, I was present in 2 ways simultaneously: the designer presenting the work, and the person who had seen what I had seen, watching the operations manager flawlessly be the operations manager and perceiving the invisible cost of it all. The second meeting was similar: efficient, professional, productive. Renato approving, directing, correcting where necessary. And I at the same time seeing the precision and seeing what that precision was covering up. There was nothing I could do about it. There was no right course of action available, and that somehow was what weighed on me the most. Not the information I carried, but the absence of any honest outlet for it within the parameters of the environment we were in. What I didn't know, and what worried me more than I wanted to admit, was whether Renato had noticed that something had changed in the way I read him. Whether there was some element in my posture, in my gaze, in the quality of our professional interactions that communicated, even unintentionally, that I knew something he didn't know I knew. The answer arrived without me planning to seek it out. 3 weeks after what I had seen, the IT team identified a synchronization failure in the camera system's access logs. The timestamps of the local records were not aligned with those on the central server, creating a discrepancy that needed to be diagnosed and corrected to ensure the integrity of the files for compliance purposes. The solution required someone with administrative access to the panel to run a full diagnostic during regular business hours, comparing the system records with the server timestamps. I had the access. The IT team wasn't available for that specific date because there was another intervention scheduled in parallel. Renato was informed of the situation and came personally to my workstation to oversee the process. We stayed side by side for 40 minutes. He pulled up a chair from the opposite side of the adjacent partition and sat next to me, both of us facing the same monitor. There was a different dynamic in this setup compared to all our previous interactions. In one-on-one meetings, there was always the desk between us, the desk as a structure, as a demarcation of space and function. Now there was nothing. He was simply beside me, like 2 colleagues solving a problem together. The conversation was technical and efficient. He knew exactly which parameters to check, what the divergent timestamp values indicated about the synchronization, and where the critical points were that needed manual correction. I executed the commands on the panel. He read the results and directed the next step. It was a natural division of labor that worked well. The kind that doesn't need much adjustment because each person is doing what they do best. The first 20 minutes were almost purely technical. Synchronization diagnostics, checking server logs, timestamp comparison, the language of the system, and nothing beyond that. I was comfortable in it. It was familiar territory. There was clarity in the parameters. There was the kind of focus that technical work creates as a natural byproduct. But there were the intervals between the commands. The moments when the system was processing and the progress bar advanced slowly, and there was nothing specific to say or do besides wait, sitting just inches away from each other in front of the same monitor. The office around us was reasonably quiet. Normal business hours, the usual murmur of work in the background, but not close enough to fill the immediate silence. During those intervals, I became aware of things that usually stay in the background, the sound of my own breathing. Renato's chair leaning slightly toward the monitor so that when he pointed to a value on the screen, his hand would pass in front of me and the space between us would shrink for a second before restoring. The faint scent of some cologne or soap that I had never noticed in meetings because we had never been this close. They were observations I hadn't asked for and categorized anyway, because the reflex to notice things doesn't have a pause button. During one of the longest pauses, a file verification cycle that took maybe 4 or 5 minutes to complete, Renato was staring at the monitor with that expression of calm expectation he always had when waiting for process results. And then, without shifting his gaze, without any transition to introduce the question, he said, "Do you stay late often?" The silence between the last technical sentence and this question was at least 2 minutes. There was nothing connecting the two. It was a question that didn't belong in that conversation. I stayed quiet for a second before answering. Not for long, just enough to be a real pause, not enough to be noticeable as a deliberate one. "Sometimes, Alta," I said, "when there's an urgent deadline that can't wait until the next day." He kept staring at the progress bar. "The building gets pretty empty after 7, and after 8 it's just the cameras." I heard the cameras and understood exactly what was being said. "Yeah," I agreed. My voice came out steady. "I'm not entirely sure how." The system finished the verification cycle. He pointed to a value in the generated report. I logged it in the document I was preparing for IT, and we continued the diagnostics. The conversation shifted back to technical parameters and stayed there until the end. When the diagnostics were done, he thanked me with his usual formality, picked up his chair, and returned it to its original spot with the care of someone who always leaves things exactly as they found them, and walked out. I stood in front of the finalized report without processing it for a solid minute. The question about staying late wasn't about logistics or work habits. It was a probe. A way to check obliquely and completely deniably if necessary, whether I had been in that building on a Thursday night 3 weeks prior. And the mention of the cameras wasn't casual. Renato knew I had been there. He didn't know with absolute certainty what I had seen, but he knew I was there, and he had calculated the possibilities of what that could mean. The question had been a way of opening a crack, offering a space for me if I wanted to confirm it, or deny it, or simply keep existing in the comfortable ambiguity that both of us could sustain indefinitely if we chose to. That was what was so extraordinarily precise about the man. Even in the moment he was being personal, he was being strategic. The question was calculated to be deniable in any direction. I had said yeah, and nothing more, which could be an agreement that the building gets empty, or it could be something else. The ambiguity existed. It was available to both of us, but the window Renato had opened with that question wasn't closing. I left that afternoon with the feeling that something had reached a point of no return, where there wasn't much room left to back away, that the next move, if there was one, wasn't entirely in my control, and that maybe it never would be, and that perhaps I had known this since that night in the parking lot with the engine off and the orange Uberlandia sky coming through the windshield. And the only question that still didn't have an answer was the one that mattered most. What happens when two people carrying the same unspoken truth finally end up in the same place, with no screen, no camera, no entire building full of people between them? It happened on a Friday shortly after 7 p.m. The administrative floor was practically empty, the automatic lights already dimmed in the areas with no movement. I was finishing up a set of adjustments on pending communication assets, the kind of detailed work that requires concentration and that I preferred to do when the office was quiet. When I went to put away a presentation laptop in a small equipment room at the end of the side hallway near the stairs, I walked past the corridor leading to Renato's glass-walled office. The door was open. I could have kept going. The more prudent, more calculated version of myself would have kept going. But I slowed down. That involuntary slowing down, that happens when your peripheral vision catches a familiar pattern and your body responds before a conscious decision can be made. Renato was there, sitting at his desk with his screen on, the exact same angle I'd seen on the camera feed that night that had changed everything. But this time he looked up before I could pass by unnoticed. I stopped in the doorway. Neither of us said anything for a moment. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are simultaneously assessing what the other knows without either being completely sure of what is being assessed. Renato was the first to speak. "You're still here." Stated as an observation, not a question. "Finishing up an approval," I said. Also not as an answer but as information. Pause. He looked at his screen for a second, then back at me. "Come in." It was an instruction phrased as an invitation, or an invitation phrased as an instruction. I walked in, standing near the entrance of the office. the presentation laptop still tucked under my arm. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the log issue we identified during last week's diagnostics, he began. There's a periodic configuration that's going to need some attention, and it makes sense to establish a protocol. He talked for maybe 15 seconds. I let him speak. Then I interrupted the most out-of-character thing I had done in 7.5 months at that office. I was here, I said, a few weeks ago, a Thursday, late. The sentence was short. There was no accusation in it, no explicit revelation of anything, nothing but a piece of information placed in the space between us. But Renato went completely still, not the defensive rigidity of someone bracing to deny something. It was a different kind of stillness, the specific stillness of someone who has just realized that something they considered private was witnessed, the body pausing as it processes that the space it thought was safe wasn't. The silence lasted long enough to be undeniable. I know, he said. His voice had lost the managerial texture that defined all his communication in the professional environment. It was simpler, more direct. A long pause. I saw the light on your desk was still on when I was leaving, he said with the voice of someone finally saying something they knew they would eventually have to say. I didn't know if you had looked at the dashboard. I still had admin access, I said. I wasn't monitoring, I just had the feed open in the background because the log report hadn't. I know, he said, not as an interruption. As the relief of not having to hear more explanations that we both knew were true but peripheral to what was being said. Another silence, this time with a different texture. Softer, like the silence after tension finally finds the room to exist instead of being contained. Renato swiveled slightly in his chair, looking at a spot between us. Not directly at me, not at the screen or the window, at the space in between. It had been a really difficult day, he said finally. It was less of an explanation than a confession. Sometimes the exhaustion hits in a way that I can't hold back the same way I hold everything else. I didn't say anything. There were things that it wasn't the right time to say. What you saw, he continued after a moment, with the deliberation of someone choosing their words more carefully than usual, isn't something that I normally. He stopped. Reconsidered. It's not a part of how I operate here. I know, I said. It was the only honest and truly sufficient thing there was to say. He looked at me then. Not with the methodical sweep of meetings, not with the evaluating neutrality he used as a professional tool. It was just a look direct, unfiltered, the kind people use when they are with real people and not the roles they occupy. You're not going to do anything with this. It wasn't a question. It was a realization, uttered with the calm confidence of someone who had already evaluated the person in front of them and come to a conclusion. No, I said. And then, because there was something else that needed to be said, it wasn't mine to do anything with. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones in that conversation. It wasn't the silence of two people avoiding something. It was the silence of two people who were, for the first time since they met, in the same place at the same time, with no screen between them. I have to finish this file, I said finally. Yeah, he said. I turned to leave. At the door to the office, I paused for a second, without fully turning around. Renato. I said his name without knowing exactly what would come next, or if anything would come next at all. Lucas. He said my name with a very specific tone. Not managerial, not professional, just the name. It was enough. It was a complete answer. I walked out, I went down the hall to my desk. I made the final adjustments to the communication pieces. I saved the files. I shut my laptop with the familiar end-of-day click. When I walked past the glass office towards the exit, the light was off. He had left. I left the building and went to the parking lot. The sky in Uberlandia in October has a luminosity I still haven't entirely gotten used to, deep and orange, as if the whole city were slightly on fire before it finally gets dark. I stood in the parking lot for a second, just looking at it. Then I left. Here's something it took me a while to figure out. The difference between being monitored and being seen. They look the same, both involve a gaze, but they're completely different things. Monitoring works one way. It's a camera, a screen, an eye that records and the person doesn't care or know about it. It's data collection, control. The comfortable lie that if you know someone's patterns, their schedule, their habits, you've got some kind of power over them. The cameras Renato installed were monitoring. They were installed under the guise of compliance and security, which was probably true, but at the same time, wasn't the whole story. And there is an almost cruel precision in the irony. The system he built to maintain control was the exact same system through which what he couldn't control in himself became visible. That Thursday night wasn't monitoring, it was being seen. And that's completely different. It goes both ways. The distance between the looker and the looked at disappears, and what's left isn't power or data, it's recognition. Recognition is worse than any exposure because you can't run. When someone truly sees you, you can't hide behind your job title, your posture, your years of doing it right, all that stuff you built. What you actually are shows up whether you want it to or not. We didn't make this into something that office could handle. We didn't flip our working relationship on its head or make some big announcement. The place stayed what it was, traditional, hierarchical, ruled by invisible codes that weren't mean but made certain kinds of honesty really, really expensive. But something changed anyway. Something that doesn't need to be named to be real. He is still the operations manager. He leads meetings with the same precision. He approves projects with the same rigor. The office structure wasn't overhauled just because two people stood in a glass room at 7 p.m. on a Friday, and for the first time existed in the same space with no performance between them. But when our paths cross now in the hallway, in meetings, in brief moments of working together, there is a different connection. Something that doesn't have an available name in the vocabularies that environment offers. It's what happens when you stop pretending that the other person is completely, exclusively the role they occupy. It's small, it's real, and sometimes the small and real is all there is and it's enough. Monday morning I got to work at the regular time. Sat at my desk, opened my projects, grabbed the headphones my armor for 7 months, held them for a second and set them down. Didn't wear them all morning. It wasn't some big statement. It wasn't even a conscious decision. That morning I just didn't need the bubble. I was okay with whatever happened. Camilla, who worked 2 meters away and noticed the headphones in my ears the same way she noticed the sun coming through the break room window at 8:30 a.m., caught the detail immediately. She stayed quiet for a considerable time. Then she leaned slightly toward my desk and said with the calm voice of someone confirming an old perception they had been waiting patiently for, "Something good happened, didn't it?" I genuinely thought about it for a second. "I think so," I said. She nodded with a small satisfaction that didn't need any more details to be complete and went back to her report. I went back to my projects. The camera system is still running. The feeds are recorded, stored for 30 days, and accessed for corporate security and contractual compliance purposes. The IT team performs periodic maintenance. The logs are checked and synchronized. Everything operates within the parameters the system was built to maintain. But I know now what security cameras actually record, when the right camera is at the right angle and the wrong person believes the building is empty. They record what happens when someone can finally just be who they are. The moments when the performance stops, not by choice but out of exhaustion, when the control sustained for years finds the crack through which it escapes, when the identity built with such precision and care rests for an instant and what lies beneath appears, not in a grand dramatic revelation, but in the simple and completely human gestures of a person who is tired of being only the official version of themselves. These moments exist in every office, in every logistics company, in every small country town, behind glass windows that seem to guarantee privacy, but are transparent on both sides, in fluorescent lit hallways that equally illuminate everyone who passes through them, on monitoring panels left open in the background on second monitors, at hours when supposedly there's no one else left to see. The system Renato installed to maintain control was the same system that revealed what was beyond his control. There is an irony in that precision that I still find too specific to be an accident. The cameras record everything. What you do with what they show. With what you see when the other person believes they aren't being watched. With the vulnerability that wasn't offered but was witnessed. That's the only part that is still completely yours. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do with it is to guard it carefully. Let it change the way you see and show up the next morning without your headphones. If this story touched on something you recognize, an environment that demands a version of you that isn't complete, or the feeling of carrying something that has nowhere to be put, leave a comment down below. I read all of them. And if you want to keep following stories like this, the subscribe button is right there. See you in the next one.